surface mining, they put excellent. Got it. And they put steam down to liquefy it to bring it up. So if it's less than 80 meters deep, they open pit mine it. If it's more than 150 meters deep, they put steam down and bring it out. And in between that, there's not currently the technology to extract it. So the oil sands is an unconsolidated mixture of oil, sand, and water. And this is just a map of the oil sands, and you can see the darker colors are thicker layers of oil sands, and the black dotted line is the area that's shallow enough to take by surface mining. The rest of it they have to take out by, we call in situ processes. And this is an older map from maybe 2015. The surface mining area, the squares are open pit mines, and all of the circles are underground mining. So it's about 3.5 million barrels a day of oil that comes out. And one of the reasons that it's so important for industry is that it is the third biggest reservoir of oil in the world. But most of these, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Libya, aren't available for private companies to go in. So it represents 52% of the world's reserves that are publicly available for companies to go in. People criticize it because you can see it from space. In the circle there, you can see the activity. If I zoom in closer and closer, it's an area about 50 kilometers from the bottom of the open pit to the top of the open pit. And these you can see are surface tailings ponds or end pit ponds that can be several kilometers across. The oil sands started in 1960s. Every drop of water they use, they get from the oil or falls on their property, they have to collect. They cannot release it. And so for almost 60 years, they've been accumulating water on the sites. Very controversial. They now have technology to treat that water, to release it, and it's extremely controversial about whether they will be allowed to release it. So lots of challenges. Shallow deposits are open pit mined. It is more greenhouse gas intensive than other types of oil extraction. Companies are required to retain water on site. The heavier elements they extract as petroleum coke, they're required to store that on site in case somebody wants to use it in future. So it's really dirty coal. Operations are in an area with relatively little development and lots of indigenous communities, and there's lots of development in a small area. This is an indigenous community at Fort Mackay, and it is now surrounded by development. And this is a picture of that area in 1984. So a lot of encroachment on these indigenous communities, a lot of impact on their traditional hunting and fishing rights. In northern Canada, there's lots of communities that still have a traditional way of living, food off the land, and obviously major impacts to their way of life. In 2008 to 2009, a couple of papers were published that showed that the amount of oil that was accumulating in snow over the winter time was the equivalent to about 8 oil tanker spills. And in the spring, when it melted, it would go into the river. And that received a lot of media attention. This is all articles from about that time. And at that time, the European Union labeled oil sands dirty oil. And the federal government stepped in and said the province in Canada, mineral resources are a provincial responsibility. But the federal government stepped in and said, you have made a mess of this. And so the federal government said, we will take over. And the industry, we will charge you $50 million a year for us to monitor the impacts. And so there was a bunch of review processes between 2010 and 11. This is a Royal Society of Canada review. This is a federal government review, a provincial government review, the Auditor General of Canada review, a scientific review that was done on the monitoring that was going on. And it said, there are many deficiencies in the monitoring. We need to improve data access. This is just the different reviews and who made the recommendation. We need adaptive management. We need better baselines. We need to integrate groundwater. We need to do a better job of integrating air, water, and land. We need to integrate the environmental impact assessment process. We need leadership and scientific advice. We need to integrate traditional knowledge. We need cumulative effects, hypothesis-driven. We need to integrate human exposure, reclamation success, better deposition data, and there was a recommendation to make an arm's length agency. And so out of this came what we called at that time the Joint Oil Sands Monitoring Program. So $50 million a year goes to the government from industry to monitor. A 3-year transition, and then it evolved from JOSM, the Joint Oil Sands Monitoring, to AWESOM, Oil Sands Monitoring. It's not awesome, but we call it awesome. And this is just a breakdown of the kind of monitoring. The blue is air quality monitoring, deposition, fugitives, fate. $6 million a year in water quality monitoring, biodiversity, and then mammals, birds, plants, amphibians, benthos, fish. The delta down at Lake Athabasca, and then the purple are indigenous community-based monitoring programs. So wildlife contaminants, berry health, water quality, and this is 2016. The program changes every year in the proportions that go to various contaminants. This is an article from January of this year that said survey finds the monitoring is ineffective after 10 years. So $500 million and the monitoring, they say, is still not working. And the criticisms in this article were the funding, lack of analysis, lack of communication, no overall plan, and a lack of coordination. And this is Kelly's review of the program, back to the original criticisms. Sorry if I turn my back to the camera. So there is some better data access. They keep coming up with new data portals, but none of them are very effective yet. Adaptive management's not really included. There are better baselines, but they're not used except for trend analysis. Some integration of groundwater. A few issues, they've partially integrated air, land, and water. It's not integrated with EIAs. Leadership and scientific advice is up to interpretation. Some integration of traditional knowledge. There's about $4 or $5 million a year that now goes to community-based monitoring. Some for cumulative effects, some for hypothesis-driven. Human exposure and reclamation is out of scope. And so there's still many, many challenges in spite of giving $500 million to a monitoring program. This is a quote from George Washington, that leadership is not only having a vision, but also having the courage, the discipline, and the resources. For the first time ever, you will see Kelly Munkittrick quote that said discipline is not only having the resources, but also having the vision, the courage, and the leadership to get you there. And the big problem with this program from the start has been courage, vision, and leadership. And so where are we after 10 years and $500 million? Multiple stakeholders can't agree. There's a lack of trust, conflicting objectives, a complicated governance structure. That governance structure has changed 5 or 6 times in 10 years. Decision making is challenging. There's not a clear vision. There's no strategic plan. There's no transparency and accountability. Data ownership and availability is a big challenge. The principal investigators retain the control and ownership of the data and the interpretation, and the control of the interpretation is not open. So more money is almost never the answer. It's about reinvesting money more effectively, and you have to build it on collaboration. The total industry spend on monitoring is actually 180 million a year they spend. So in just 10 years, they spent 1.8 billion collecting monitoring across 74 different types of monitoring programs. But nobody looks at the data. And why don't they give it to academia? They don't give it to universities because professors sometimes don't deliver a product on topic, on time, or on budget. So the money goes to consultants, because in the program, when the monitoring went from industry to consulting, every year they would get about a 1,000-page report on the results. There's been no report from the government in 10 years. Lots of scientific papers, but no reporting. So you need to make sure it's holistic, including stressor effect, effects-based and values-based. So one of the challenges we have is that the province wants monitoring to focus on the stressors. The federal government wants to focus on the effects. The communities want to focus on their values. And each of them don't agree you need to do what the other one wants to do. So you have to make sure it's transdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, and that it carefully looks at Indigenous perspectives. Collaboration is hard, and good collaboration is really, really hard. I had someone tell me that many years ago when I started with the Canadian Water Network. And working with people with different perspectives and different backgrounds is very, very hard. So this is the way I think of it. I look at my research program as a boat. My funding are sails. My deliverables are anchors. If my boat is not moving, I need less anchors or more sail. And so if you want to do something together, you can tell everybody, bring all of your sails, bring all of your anchors, and we will build a big boat. Or you can tell them, bring your boats and we'll all sail somewhere together. Or you can tell them, let's anchor our boats in the same harbor, and when the tide changes, it will look like we're doing something together. Or you can say, paint your boat the same color as mine, and we will pretend we're doing something together. Or you can say, here's a flag. Put it on your boat if you want. So those are the 5 different kind of ways that you can try and do stuff. And this is very, very hard. And probably getting people to try to sail together is the easiest thing. If you do this, maybe you can get people to send people over in their dinghies to do something together. But it's very hard, and when we have built networks, getting a common understanding of what you are doing and how you are doing it is the hardest part. So what does this mean for CRHIAM? Ensuring scientific excellence, creating additional scientific capacity, informing decision makers on key issues, and providing outreach to key parts of society is not enough on its own for impact. You need to have meaningful, increased involvement and collaboration with industry and local, regional, and central government agencies, with a focus on involvement and dialogue in water policy and strategic industry needs and objectives. Who are the problem owners? What do they need? When do they need it? From their perspective, what would it look like? Those are the kinds of questions you need to ask. Researchers at universities, and I am a researcher at a university, I think of them as drug pushers. They are trying to push their technology and their techniques. But if you have an end user who is pulling, it's much easier to get movement. So rather than just research or push, you need end users pulling to be able to make a difference. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, to focus on outcomes, not outputs. And I tried to find a word for outcome in Spanish, and there's not
a good translation.
There's not a good one.
Yeah.
Outcome, if you put in the dictionary, it says salir. Outcomes, it says resultados. So there's not, but maybe this will help. Inputs are researchers, students, partners, end users, funding. Outputs are workshops, meetings, reports, policy briefings, tools, models, websites. Those are all outputs. Outcomes, in the short term, strengthen relationships, increase knowledge, changes in attitudes, opportunities for research, advancement in innovations and methods. Medium term, increased ability to adapt to change, to manage risks, changes in practice, policy, and regulation, institutional changes, informing investment decisions, cost savings, risks avoided, and long-term impacts on public ecosystem health and economy. So those are outcomes. And too often in academia, because of the way we are evaluated, we focus on outputs. So what does success like? Getting money doesn't solve the problems. Forget the outputs. If you have good people and funding, the outputs will come. You will have students, you will have papers, you will have policy briefings. But researchers don't hold the pen on policy, practice, institutional reform, investment choices, or risk perception. The end users and your partners have control of that. So you need your partners to be involved to achieve real outcomes, and they need to be integrated into the process. So the difference between science communication and knowledge mobilization, one is telling people what you found, the other is putting the results into action to make change. So there are lots of barriers for researchers. Lack of time. Every researcher thinks they are 110% busy, or maybe 120% busy. Lack of funding, incentives, little formal training, capacity and skills, lack of a common language, difficulty identifying partners, difficulty connecting with partners, conflicting priorities and timelines, mistrust and bad experiences, lack of familiarity with application, and for the end users, lack of time, organizational culture, incentives, political priorities, capacity and skills, common language I'll come back to again, difficulty identifying high quality relevant research, conflicting priorities and timelines, mistrust and bad experiences, too much information, no access to information, and the big one, information is not actionable. It's not given to them in a way that they can actually use it. One of the things that's really hard for academics to understand is governments and industry have no idea how universities work. They have no idea. When I was in industry, I kept fighting. They wanted to get a committee of vice presidents of research together and make demands of the professors on what research they should do. And I said, the only way that will work is if you get a vice president of research to tell them what you don't want them to do, because they will do the opposite of what they're told. So there's a bunch of different things that people confuse as collaboration. Observing, magic finger, reviewing, consulting, participating, cooperating, collaborating, negotiating, or commanding. Those are all different, but in multi-stakeholder groups, you get people at the table that are trying to do all those things, as opposed to actually working together. Communication is the hardest thing, because people use the same words and they mean very different things. And the example I like to use is in 2006, a group in Mexico asked me to come and give a course on ecological risk assessment, a 10-day course. And I had many discussions with them. At the end, what do you want the students to learn? What do you want the students to do? What do you want? And so we went to give the course, and 3/4 of the way through the course, I found out in Mexico, what they call risk assessment, in Canada, we call impact assessment. And what they call impact assessment, we call risk assessment. So I was teaching them a course on they didn't even want. But we couldn't, even though we met many times before the course, they couldn't communicate what they wanted to know. And so communication is really hard. At the Canadian Water Network, we worked a lot with end users, and what we found was that continuous discussion and meetings improved the researchers' ability to understand the decision context the end users had, and the end user to understand the limitations of the research. And to make it actionable, you need to treat project development as an evolving conversation. Many times when I go into a meeting with end users, I have a clear idea of what I want to do, but when the project starts, I'm doing something different. Because what I wanted to do wasn't going to be useful for them. And so, we'll skip this. So there's many steps to a project, and if you've integrated the researchers with it, here, Javi, get out of my way. Identifying and connecting with end users, you have to determine the relevant and interested end users, and you have to build relationships. Then you have to jointly establish end user and researcher priorities and interests. And then you have to jointly establish a project plan, the goals and purpose, jointly establish the project scope and methodology, jointly do project updates, reports, and meetings, translate the results into non-technical language, jointly determine the practical meaning of the results, disseminate the findings through end user appropriate publications, workshops, and talks for end users and meetings. You will get your publications, but you have to do different ones to be useful for them. And then joint evaluation of scientific impact. And then you're at the end of the circle where you are with CRHIAM 1, and you have to expand the partners, figure out what things are useful to going on, and what are the new issues. And so this circle now comes inside, and you start a new circle. And when you get around that a second time, the project keeps growing, and you expand it again, and now you've got 3 circles. And so one of our big programs in Canada right now is called Global Water Futures. It's $180 million. It evolved out of a smaller circle that was a project worth $40 million, which came out of a smaller one, which was a project worth $10 million. So when you get to the end of a cycle, you need to look at which end users you have integrated into what you're doing, and then expand to deal with the new questions. And so the circle just becomes iterative. Iterative, is that a word for Spanish? Excellent. Iterativo?
No.
So partnership building, you have to define the end users. You have to let them tell you what the research needs are and what outcomes they want. That helps you identify the benefits. And then you can define the knowledge gaps, the research streams, the relationships to end users for co-development of projects, and you can capture the outputs. So Kelly's advice, build relationships, the projects will follow. Be patient. Academics don't know nearly as much as they think they do. They know a lot about what they do. They don't know very much about how to use it. Develop a common language, listen well, adjust your end goals and learn what brings value to everybody. Be creative. Be clear about what you are not doing. Seek clarity. jointly define what success will look like and value the journey. What brings more enjoyment? More papers or more friends? So you need to have fun, or why do it? And science, like life, it's the journey that's important. So, thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions from the audience. I think that there's.
This is the point where people say, I disagree with you.
Yeah, sure. You may disagree, of course. No? So the floor is open. Preguntas del público.
Or online questions.
Esto que diría.
Silence means consensus and everything I said is true.
So, from your perspective, I mean, how important?
Christian from the department.
Yeah. How important is building social capital in terms to to communicate in the same language?
It's very, very important. And when you get different groups in a room, they all use the same words to mean different things. And we had one project where I had to stay up all night to try and, we had an exercise where I said, you have an ecosystem that does this, and an impact happens, and your ecosystem changes. What do you call this? What do you call this? What do you call that? And then I had to spend all night trying to rephrase what I did in the language that they used before they understood what we were trying to do. It's very hard. And academics get very sloppy with their terminology.
Yeah. Any other question? I think that we all were thinking because we were waiting to see your data monitoring. But I think that you point a very key point. I mean, one of the issues that we are facing now, even in Chile, in relationship to this, is trust.
Mm-hmm.
Build trust. So people doesn't trust. And probably scientists has the higher trust capability in the Chilean society today. No, people trust more or less in scientists. But they want some kind of virgin science. In terms of that they have no compromise with industry, they are independent, they are not any kind of compromise, even policy compromise or politics compromise.
Yes, I can show you. One of the challenges we always have is because I've always done research with industry, people think that my research isn't valid sometimes. But there's many examples of government research which is very biased. In the oil sands program, there's lots of biased science, but people believe it because it comes from academics or from government. If it comes from industry, they will not believe it.
No.
So, Evelyn.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly, for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. But also, it's a little bit sad to see how difficult this is. No? And I'm thinking about the monitoring program, for example, in the BOPO, the rural basin that you know very well.
Yeah.
And what I can see is that many times the problem is that the legal framework is not enough, and the stakeholders are very attached to them. So if the legal framework is not the right for example, have cooperation between all or among all the different users, then there is no possibility to get in to that point of the need of collaboration. I don't know if you understand my point.
Yeah, but it's always a challenge to find where to start and who to start with. When we worked in pulp and paper in Canada, when we did our first cycle of monitoring for all of our pulp and paper mills, two of the big companies every one of their mills, we found reproductive problems. The one company said, this program doesn't work. It sees problems everywhere. Another company came to us and said, we have problems at all of our mills. Will you work with us to help us? And so it's finding the early adopters, the people who want to work with you. And that's the hard part when you start. Because once you start and you find someone, they will talk inside of industry to find more partners. But it's finding the first ones is the hard part. And building trust is, for me, a 5 to 8 year process to build. You have to have a successful project, and then you have to have a second successful project before they start to trust you. So it takes time. But in a CRHIAM kind of 10-year cycle, you have time to start trust. And then those trusted partners can try to bring other partners. They will know in the industry who are thinking forward and who are dinosaurs.
Okay, anyone? Mariela?
Thank you for the presentation. I was thinking, in one list that you show us about contribution, collaboration with the final user, no?
Yes.
The ways that you can follow, we can follow. But maybe one is what's not there is co-creation.
Yes.
Because you can, when you co-create with people, also they can be very involved with the,
Yes.
with the idea, with the question, or scientific question.
Yes. Yes, that's what that circle is supposed to be, that the co-creation is involving them at all steps of the project, right from the very start. And that it's an evolving conversation. You need to talk to them about what you want to do and what they need, and then let the project develop from that, as opposed to, when I was in industry, I would get calls. We were a strategic planning hub for 17 companies. And the university professors would phone me and they'd say, I have a new tool that will solve your problem. I never had one phone me to say, what are your problems? So, yeah, it's hard. Any online questions?
Yes, online question. ¿Alguien de la audiencia online?
Que levanten la mano para...
Sí, puede levantar la mano y les abre el micrófono. No question from the audience.
And then that is
I think-
consensus among the audience, that it is lunchtime.
Ok, muchas gracias entonces por la asistencia. Un aplauso.